Well, I'm very pleased to be here, and I think the concept of the Institute is really terrific. I'm very impressed just from the little I've found out about it so far. As Professor Sunesson has already indicated, migration is one of the, and Professor Bäcklund, migration is a constant in human history, but it is also something that changes in its nature all the time. So we're talking about both the statics and dynamics of society when we talk about migration. And of course, we know now from archaeological findings that humanity originated in the Great Lakes district of Eastern Africa. And that humanity spread from the Great Lakes region all over the world. So we have, in migration studies, we have a need for archaeology, for geography, for legal frameworks, for just about every social scientific discipline you can think of. And now we are interested in the relationship between migration and climate change, which is a fairly new topic. However, although it's a constant in human history, the form changes. And my argument here is that as society undergoes social transformations, the forms of migration and the volume of migration also shift. So I'm going to talk in a minute about the theory of social transformation. But first of all, just a few examples of how migration has become politicized, if I can work this. Yes. I'm sure all of you are familiar with this very famous picture. This is Nigel Farage, leader of the UK Independence Party, standing in front of a poster they had glued on the side of a bus, where you see these alien hordes coming to take over Europe. And this is the sort of fear-mongering that we have to deal with a lot in the migration area. Of course, it's not just in Britain that this happened. The migration has been a major issue in European elections in recent years, and we've seen a growth of the extreme right, which almost always is based upon a demonization of migrants. And it's not just in Europe. In late 2018, right now, we see this exodus from Venezuela. 2.3 million Venezuelans are estimated to have left their country up to July 2018, where the economy is breaking down. People seek a solution by moving somewhere else. And of course, they are not always very welcome because they're seen by the population of the receiving country sometimes as a problem, as has been already indicated. We see the same in Asia, for instance. You know the example of the Rohingya, a Muslim minority in Myanmar, where extreme persecution has led to a mass flight to another very poor country, namely Bangladesh. In Australia, we have a situation where the society is based on migration. 28% of the population are first-generation migrants. At least another 20% of the population are their children. So about 40% of or 50 almost, of the Australian population have a direct link to migration. And yet, we see a demonization of migration by people who themselves are migrants. In fact, everyone in Australia is a migrant, except for the very small, it's about 3% of the population who are indigenous people. We have a party in Australia called the One Nation Party that wants to keep out Muslim migrants, prohibit Islamic dress, and ban halal certification of food. And we see some real political opportunism at the moment with the Australian Labor Party, where most Labor supporters oppose the government's very draconian and repressive asylum policy. But the Labour Party goes along with this government policy because they say the people are so opposed to migration, we have to recognize that. There is a real lack of leadership there. So we see an upsurge in nationalism and populism with opposition to immigration as its main mobilizing force. And even in Sweden, which has a reputation for being a very social democratic or liberal society, we see now the Democrats getting almost 20% in the recent elections. On a more positive note, the United Nations held its first ever summit of heads of states on migration and refugees in September 2016, an initiative of President Obama. And the result was a discussion between the heads of states and officials, and we see now there is a global compact on migration that has been worked out and is due to be ratified at a summit in Marrakesh next month. 192 countries agreed on the text of the compact, but the one country which withdrew from it before it got to a decision level was the USA. The world's biggest immigration country will not sign this compact. Personally, I'm very skeptical about the compact anyway, because we see states which already are not observing international law. For instance, Australia is a signatory to the UN Convention on Refugees, but when you see the offshore detention, the conditions, the fact that they are not letting refugees come to Australia to make asylum claims, Australia is violating international law. So supporting this global compact will not necessarily change anything, I regret to say. In any case, the global compact is only about regular migration, and there's more and more irregular migration, people crossing borders without having the necessary documentation. But before I go further into this, I'd like to talk about the concept of social transformation. So we're talking there, I won't read it out, but sometimes a certain part of social relations changes in such a dramatic way that it affects everything else. So, for instance, the industrial revolutions in Britain and other European countries were one such social transformation. This has been documented in a book by Karl Polanyi called The Great Transformation, and I want to use that as a framework for analyzing how migration has changed in the last 50 or 60 years. Joe Stiglitz, who you know is a Nobel Prize winner for economics, wrote the preface to the 2001 edition of The Great Transformation, and he argues that the structural adjustment programs imposed on poorer countries by the IMF and the World Bank lead not just to economic change, but also to profound social, political, and cultural transformation, often with negative consequences for affected populations. So this is the central idea that a major shift in economic organization, like the Industrial Revolution, is firstly not just a technological issue, but an issue of ideology. It required the ideology of liberalism to make it work. But it also affects every other area of society: religion, family relationships, politics, education, and so on. One of Polanyi's ideas is that there are certain, what he calls fictitious commodities, things that are not really produced as commodities, but become commodities in a capitalist society. And with fictitious commodities, he means specifically land, labor, and money. And since I was just talking to Professor Sunesson about the contribution Bob Jessup has made to using these concepts. And Bob Jessup has added a fourth commodity, knowledge, which has now become a commodity to be sold, to be patented, to be kept secret from competitors and so on. Polanyi argued that the ideological dominance of market liberalism was based on the idea of a self-regulating economy which was disembedded from other parts of society. There was no need to regulate the economy. It would regulate itself in the liberal ideology. And the problem about that, according to Polanyi, is that it tends to destroy land, in other words, the environment, the reproduction of labor, because people will, if wages are pushed down to a minimum, people will not have the means to rear families, and so there will be a shortage of labor in the next generation. And of course, money is not a commodity that's produced for market exchange, but it has become one. So Polanyi argues that society tends to protect itself through what he calls a double movement. And a double movement means resistance to unfettered capitalism through the development of trade unions, industrial legislation, social democratic parties, and even anti-liberal movements which don't put the economy first, like communism in the Soviet Union and fascism in Italy and Germany. And remember, Polanyi his book was published in 1944 at the end of the war, and he argued that now the war would have changed society again and would lead to conditions of full employment and welfare states. So that's basically the theory. Polanyi has been heavily criticized by people who have argued that his theory is Eurocentric and only applies to European society. For instance, it's been argued that India there is industrialization taking place, but not the type of development that Polanyi envisaged, because there are such huge labor reserves. But if you look at countries like South Korea and China, you find the Polanyian model fits quite well. But I won't go into that in more detail. It would take too long. So what I really want to talk about is phases of migration since 1945 and how they are linked to the political economy of the capitalist system. So in the first phase, in the late 1940s to the early 1970s, we have a concentration of manufacturing industry in old industrial core countries. So the countries which were already the leading powers in industrialization are re-established, even Germany, Japan, and Italy, which have done badly in the war. And this matches this idea of full employment and a welfare state. But there has to be some mechanism whereby employers regulate wages, and you can't do it in a closed labor market. And that's why you get massive import of labor in this phase. I think it's sort of the archetypical form is what happened in Germany, the guest worker system, where migrant workers were not allowed to bring independence. There was a rotation principle that they would go away again after a few years, and there was an expectation that if there were an economic recession, that the migrants would have to go. In other parts of the world, there was also large-scale immigration which matched this pattern. I mean, it varies from country to country, and I can't go into detail on that here. The mechanisms used for subjugating workers were different. In countries like Germany, France, and so on, there was a rigid guest worker system, which, in other words, racism was inscribed in its institutions. In countries which imported labor from their former colonies, usually migrants were citizens, so they could stay and they could bring in their families, but there the regulatory mechanism was informal racism. Black people could only get inferior jobs. But this was a phase of rapid expansion, what the French call les 30 glorieuses, the 30 glorious years. And it came to an end with the oil crisis of 1973. That's the marker. I mean, the processes were underway anyway. So you get a massive shift of investment to the global north, the end of labor import to old core industrial countries. And along with that comes the ideology to modernize former colonies and to cut the welfare state in the existing developed countries. But the expectation that the guest workers would get up and leave proved to be completely false. Countries with strong human rights legislation, like Germany, like France, found that the courts would not allow the prevention of family reunion. It was seen as a human right. And you get now a concentration of migrants in declining industrial areas. In Britain, I think that Sweden is probably a similar case, although in Sweden, welfare policy plays a part in it too. In the UK, you find people of Pakistani and Indian origin concentrated in old textile-producing towns where the workers gone over, usually to India and Bangladesh. In the so-called classical countries of immigration, like the USA and Australia, there is continuing settlement immigration, but a growing stress on skills rather than family reunion. Up to then, for instance, Australia had seen immigration mainly as population building. Now it became much more an economic issue. And then you get these new immigration areas emerging, the Gulf oil states, massive labor import. Today, if you go to Saudi Arabia or Kuwait or any of these, the Emirates, you will find there are more foreign workers than there are natives in these countries. But they are rigidly controlled. They're not allowed to settle. They're not allowed to bring their families in. Whether that can be sustained is another matter. At the same time, you get refugee struggles because everywhere there were violent conflicts about state formation in this period. So in the third phase, which really goes on seamlessly from the previous one, we have the dominance of the neoliberal economic model. It's the only game in town, so to speak. The Soviet Union is no longer exists, in fact, and obviously cannot be a model for emerging developing countries. The post-industrial countries save on the costs of education by importing semi-finished human capital, as an Indian colleague, Binod Kadria, has put it. In other words, people come in who have degrees from an Indian Institute of Higher Technology, which are usually of very high quality. Then they do their master's or PhD in the USA, Canada, Britain, or Australia. And then they become so indebted because the overseas students' fees are very high, that they are forced to stay in those countries and join the labor force as skilled workers. At the other end of the spectrum, we have less skilled migrant workers. All the political leaders of all developed states say we don't need low-skilled workers. In fact, this is not true because their own populations are not willing to be street cleaners, builders, and carers for children and the elderly. So migration continues in the low-skilled categories, but it is mainly irregular migration. And the interesting case there is the United States, which as a highly efficient and effective state, you would think would be able to control and organize migration. Instead, there were, I think the peak figure was 12 million undocumented workers in about 2008. It's gone down a little bit now. But that is the origin of this polemic of President Trump at the moment, to say we don't need these people. And in fact, of course, there is a great economic need for them. At the same time, we have a growth of refugee inflows. Global forced migration is at its highest level since the end of the Second World War. The question is, are these wars coincidental at this time, or are they linked to what is happening in the economy at the same time? For instance, to what extent does the conflicts in the Middle East depend on the massive arms shipments that come, first of all, from the United States, but also Britain and France, and now, more recently, from Russia, I should say, as well. So we have 68 million forced migrants, and 40 million of them are internally displaced. Now, that sounds a little bit harmless to be internally displaced. It's actually worse than being a refugee, because there is a global institution, UNHCR, to protect refugees, but there is no protection for people who remain in their own state. No UN body can intervene there. So this figure, I think that's really shocking. 44,400 people per day are forced to flee their own country every day. And 85% of them are hosted in poor countries like Bangladesh for the Rohingya, or Kenya for South Sudanese. And I always, when I'm giving a talk in Australia, I always mention 44,000 people per day. Australia takes about 18,000 refugees per year. There is such a gap between the need for protection and the reality of what is available. Before President Trump came to power, the United States was the biggest receiver of resettled refugees, about 100,000 a year. That's gone down to, is it 40,000 now? Something like that. So there are 7 million people in refugee camps who really need resettlement, who've been in these camps for at least 5 years. 7 million. Work out, if there are 60,000 resettlement places available, how long will it take to resettle 7 million people? So we are coming into a fourth phase, and this is what I really want to talk about. I guess the time is not on our side. I would argue, and I'm sure the economists among you will have varying opinions on the topic, I would argue that the global financial crisis of 2008 was a turning point in the neoliberal project. And the question is, can we already identify what the meaning of this new phase is? Does it mean that there will be a decline in neoliberal globalization, more nationalism, populism, and protectionism? Is it the start of a new type of globalization, or just a new ideological format for globalization? And then what are the consequences for the different types of migration? Are there new forms of differentiation and racism emerging? And I think this is what we really need to try and anticipate. I mean, it's very difficult to anticipate, to really be sure about future trends. But I think when we look at populism, then we really need to think, what does this mean? Is this just going back to the old form of populism of the 19th century? Or is something new happening? So let me focus on that topic. I think I've left a slide out. Hang on. Oh yes, I just wanted to show you this, this diagram, which is based on United Nations population division figures. This is the total number of migrants in different years, and it's distinguishing between developing regions and developed regions. And you can see that it's growing. There's a newer figure actually now, it's 258 million. But it isn't all that much compared with global population. It's about 3.3% of global population are migrants. I think it is worth remembering that and keeping it in perspective. But it is interesting to see that it's mainly migration to the developed world. There is a lot of migration between developing countries based on differential opportunities for different types of workers, but the biggest figure is still in the developed countries. All right, so let me put the question, if I'm right that this is a new stage in the world economy, that after the 2008 recession, does this mean that politics take over, that we will have populist politics that go against economic interests, or is there some way of bringing them together? And I believe what is happening is that we are getting a form of populist politics which is anti-migrant, but it isn't actually stopping migration. What it does is mean that there will be more restrictions on migration, more irregular migration, more migration within strict contract systems, which leave very little space for people's human rights. So the sort of the Saudi model of highly controlled migration will expand, but I think the US model of irregular migration will also expand. And I would be interested to know, when President Trump is speaking in such anti-migration terms, has he really talked to the agricultural entrepreneurs of the south of the United States? Nearly all the fruit is picked by migrants who can be deported between harvests when they're not needed, or just stay in the United States and eke out a living from the very limited job opportunities when it's not harvest time. So my argument would be that we are moving towards a situation where there is both populism, anti-migration populism, getting into all the parliaments one can think of, including the United States, and including Sweden, unfortunately. So there is an obvious conflict between that populism and the benefits that transnational companies gain from employing migrants. The new form of production is that things can be assembled wherever the work is, or can be bits of things, really, components of commodities can be produced wherever it's cheapest to produce them, and assembled or marketed from developed countries. So the value capture takes place in the developed countries. And where it is possible to reduce migration by doing that, because of course a lot of the manufacturing work is no longer done in developed countries. They've become post-industrial states. But the transnational division of labor is not a weakening of the control of large companies based in the global north. It's not restricting it, it's just a new way of doing it. What we are seeing at the moment is that even white-collar jobs and quite highly skilled jobs are being exported. For instance, software development, to a large extent, now takes place in India for big companies. But even so, there will always be jobs where migrants are needed in the country, in a country like Sweden. So like menial cleaning jobs, I've already mentioned, but also there are forms of like building houses, building places to live in, has to be done in the countries where they're needed. So there will always be a need for migrants. As populations in the north stagnate, I mean, in Australia, we would be having a population decline if it were not for immigration, because Australian women are not having enough children to lead to population stability or increase. It's migration that has led both to increase through the actual coming into the country of people, but it's also through the fact that women migrate in a childbearing age and then have children in developed countries. So anyway, let me, how are we going for time? Yeah. Let me sum up what I wanted to say, if I can find it. Okay. It's impossible to predict future migration trends, but there is no reason to expect a decline in the volume and importance of international migration. It will just change its form. What has increased dramatically is the politicization of migration and hostility to certain categories of migrant, especially refugees and low-skilled migrants. In a period of political and economic uncertainty, migrants and refugees have become the visible face of a global economic system that has failed to deliver for the majority of the population. Wars fed both by racism and the massive arms deals that put modern weapons in the hands of repressive regimes will continue to generate flows of refugees and asylum seekers. And let us remember, too, that many refugees and asylum seekers do have high qualifications and could very well serve in the interests of the countries that import them. Diverting the blame onto migrants is a dangerous strategy which has unpleasant parallels with the past. Racism against minorities is a strategy for attacking everybody's rights. And I should explain a bit what I mean by that. We now have a thing called the gig economy. Is that phrase? It's the idea that people are not paid anymore for doing a regular job which is needed all the time. They don't have a fixed employment. They are paid by the job they do. And that leads to a great deal of insecurity on the part of working class people. And it's easy to turn that feeling of insecurity into hostility to migrants. Diverting the blame, oh, I've already said that. It is crucial to work together with migrant and civil society organizations to build a global movement to improve and safeguard the labor rights and human rights of all migrants. The Global Compact, which will be declared as progress by the 192 signatories when it's signed in Marrakesh, will only be as good as its implementation. And if states have signed up to international law but don't implement it anyway, why should we expect it to be very different? It could be different if there were a powerful body set up to monitor the human rights, monitor the safety of migration channels, and so on. If we had a sort of World Trade Organization for migration, there could be a change, but there is no sign of that happening. Such a movement can only be an effective counterforce to right-wing populism if it takes seriously the concerns of all the social groups, not just migrants, which are experiencing insecurity and declining living conditions as a result of the new forces shaping economics and politics. And what I mean by that is that migration policy is often unsuccessful because it is about migration and not about these basic structures. And we need a perspective on migration, and I know you've understood that here at this institute. We need a perspective on migration that sees it as part of a general societal development. And we need to include non-migrants and the disadvantages some of them face and the insecurity some of them face. We need to include non-migrants in successful migration policies. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stuart. Thank you for this great presentation that shows us the complex interaction between migration and other type of transformations in the society, and also for keeping your time. But we have 10 minutes for you still for questions. So I can actually take you to this chair if you want to. So, are there any questions? Oh, yes. And we have only scheduled 10 minutes for questions, but we have a panel discussion afterwards, so don't worry if you all cannot ask your questions. Yes. You. But Michael.
Yeah, thank you very much for an interesting talk. I just want to ask one question related to
Let's see if we need a mic.
demand in richer countries. So I have a question regarding the labor demand and how that's going to drive, the future migration. So in many richer countries, there's an ongoing trend about, artificial intelligence and automation. That's going to change the labor demand and shift the labor demand. Most likely, it's going to reduce the demand in many low-skill sectors, right? And that could be probably creates additional populism or whatever against migration. So do you think that will be an additional factor in driving the future migration? And also, could that be a major play, to what extent that factor are going to play a role in that regard? Thank you.
Should I answer?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I mean, for 50 years, we've been talking about work being replaced by technology. And what happens really is as work is replaced by technology, new products emerge and there are new needs. And I mean, some needs will probably continue to expand, and I'm thinking there of the care sector. I mean, there are attempts to introduce robots in Japan in the care sector, but it is actually a very fast-growing sector, and one wonders how effective that will be. It's interesting, in Germany during the 2008 recession, male migrant employment dropped because they were in manufacturing jobs, but female migrant employment continued to rise. So let's say it's what you're saying is a possibility, but we don't really know, and it could go either way.
Yes. We have one more question over there.
Thank you, and thank you for your excellent and interesting presentation. Two brief questions. On the Global Compact, you expressed your skepticism, but of course it is a very ambitious attempt to present migration as the kind of constant, as you say, in human history. To what extent, and even though the US and some European states are now withdrawing, to what extent has the work on the Global Compact sort of influenced the discourse, the understanding of migration as a phenomenon? And my other question is, there may be around 250 million international migrants, but there are probably around 500 additional internal migrants. You sort of, one easily jumps immediately to the international dimension of migration, but from a social transformation perspective today, what would be your brief comment on internal migration?
Okay, well, let me go to your first question first. I agree with you. I think you're right. I mean, working on the Global Compact has improved the knowledge and perceptions of the people who've done it, but it has been a relatively limited field of people who've been involved in it. So I think the really important thing about the Global Compact is, you know, the principles it lays down in terms of safe, regular and orderly migration are very good, but unless there is a body that oversees their implementation, we have to be quite skeptical. I mean, I hope it is, you know, I hope I'm wrong. I hope my pessimism is mistaken. On the internal migration issue, you're absolutely right. I should have said that I've only been considering international migration because in terms of populism, of course, it's usually international migration that is relevant. But internal migration is enormous. I mean, there is as much internal migration in China from the west to the east coasts, industrial cities, as there is international migration altogether. So yeah, one should include that.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for a very interesting talk, Stephen. My question also relates to, or we can use the Global Compact to enter into it. It concerns what you're talking about, the question I found intriguing. Well, is there a new type and ideological format going on in a new form of globalization now? And so my question is, when we talk about fictitious knowledge like you do, and you look at the Global Compacts, they are saturated in language about data about migrants. And I think perhaps one of the new forms we are witnessing emerging is, some have called it refugee economies, but I think of it as marketization of displacement, or rather data about displacement. And this may feature both within this new form of neoliberalization, but it also accords with the sort of the neo-nationalistic drive, whether it's Saudi or US, you know, this pervasive data hoarding that you see, which is also in the Global Compacts. Would you agree with such an assessment? What's your comment on that?
Well, there's a very interesting book that's been published that includes well, it's a book by Paul Collier, who used to be the managing director, I think, of the World Bank, or what was he? He was a senior economist of the World Bank, and Alex Betts of the Oxford Refugee Studies Centre. And they have a wonderful critique of the existing refugee regime at a global level. And then they propose that the solution is marketization of refugees. They suggest that the huge refugee camps on the borders with Syria, you know, in Turkey and Jordan and so on, should be the center of industrial development areas to use the skills and the ability of migrants, of refugees. I'm very skeptical about that type of solution. And I think the use of a large amount of data, or the production of that data and its valuation, is quite skeptical, quite worrying. But I think that that is something we see in many other fields in society, that the improvement of data has clearly administrative benefits, but it also means that we've become very transparent, that the state can see a lot about each person if they want to. I guess the most extreme form of that is the use of identification by cameras in, well, we see it in our airports, but it's used on the street in China now, so that the idea is the population can be controlled by knowing that they are always being observed. So I'm a bit worried about that.
Okay. Do we have... Can you pass the microphone?
Thank you for a solid presentation, and thank you for your work on migration. It goes back for, 30 years. Thank you for that. I think I have a kind of simple question. What you think we should do? I think it's very unfair, and what you think we should do in terms of, if you could decide what kind of research agenda, young scholars in the topic of migration should have, what could you say they should do?
Okay, well, there are two things, of course. There is what one can do in academic work and what one can do in one's personal political affiliation. In academic work, I think it's very important that we have a critical understanding of what drives migration and what sort of patterns are emerging. I think, the critical migration studies is what we really need. And remember that migration research has largely been done for administrative reasons up to now, and we are just beginning to see a more social scientific approach. So that's the academic side. The personal side, of course, is if one wants to work with migrant movements, one has to accept that they have their own leadership and that they will define what's useful for non-migrants to do. And I think we have to take a very sensitive approach there in trying to find out what academics can do to help. So, yeah, those two things.
Okay, are there more questions? Okay.
Would you add to the factors driving international migration the growing migration industry? This is not, we have it in Sweden, the import of seasonal workers from Southeast Asia and of course, traffickers in women and children, etc. So would you think that this is more important, or at least deserve attention in relation to the fourth, the media? I think it has to be studied whether the refugees from Syria looked around what media portrayal of Sweden or Norway and decided we will go there. Because that is not the issue. People move because they are forced to, or they don't have an alternative, or because they have a decision. Not necessarily accusing the messenger. Thank you.
Okay, well, I think that's absolutely right, that we need to pay more attention to trafficking and smuggling of migrants and indeed to the migration industry, which includes, of course, elements of the state. But I think we should also be careful, because I remember a couple of years ago, the United States was using polemics about people trafficking as a way of restricting migration. And putting forward a very strong discourse on the amount of trafficking for sex work and so on. So we need to do that, but to do it carefully so that we don't reinforce such polemics.
Oh, yeah. And with that message, we can now wrap up the first talk. Thank you very much, Stephen.